Country houses are the successors to castles and manor houses, which may have been fortified, with the earliest country houses being built in the Tudor and Elizabethan period. The relative peace of the 16th century, after the civil unrest of the Wars of the Roses, meant that houses designed for the gentry and aristocracy were being built on open land within their estates. This is a whistle-stop tour of East Yorkshire country houses. Some country houses are still lived in by families who have owned them for centuries. One such is Burton Agnes Hall. Burton means settlement at a fortified dwelling, and the first record of the name Burton Agnes was around 1175. Roger de Strutville had built a manor house there 2 years earlier, and the Great Hall and Norman Undercroft can still be seen today. As de Strutville's wife was named Agnes, it seems logical that the settlement was named after her. Burton Agnes Hall was built around 1600 to designs by Robert Smithson, master mason to Elizabeth I, who had also designed Hardwick Hall and Longleat House. The hall, built by Smithson, was the home of Sir Henry Griffiths, who, when he became a member of the Council of the North, abandoned the house he was building at his estate in the Midlands to move to Yorkshire. As with many houses of this time, the Great Hall is a major feature, and the Great Hall at Burton Agnes is no exception, with a fabulous chimney and carved screen. Burton Agnes Hall was supposedly haunted by Sir Henry's youngest daughter. The young girl loved the new house, but one day, having been to visit neighbours, as she returned home, she was attacked, robbed, and badly injured. She was taken back to the hall, where she vowed that she wouldn't rest unless part of her remained within the house she loved. When she died a few days later, she was buried in the nearby churchyard. But true to her word, she did not rest, and began to haunt the house until her skull was removed from her grave and placed back in the house, built into one of the old walls. Whilst the skull remains in the house, all is said to be well, and the lady sleeps soundly. The hall is still lived in by descendants of Sir Henry Griffiths. Another Elizabethan mansion is Burton Constable Hall, also occupied by the same family for centuries. In this case, Constable is the name of the family who first lived there in the 13th century. Burton Constable Hall is a little older than Burton Agnes Hall, having been built by Sir John Constable in the 1560s. The 18th century front door leads straight into the Great Hall, designed by Timothy Lightoller, who was also chosen to design the dining room and the staircase hall, as well as a stable block and carriage house in the 1760s. By the 18th century, William Constable, like many of his class, had been on the grand tour to Europe and was a great plant collector, growing a wide variety of plants in the grounds. William commissioned Lancelot Capability Brown to produce plans for the parkland, and although his initial plans were rejected by Constable, Brown did begin work on further plans for landscaping the estate in 1769. William also commissioned Thomas Chippendale to supply furniture and mirrors for the drawing room and ballroom. As well as that, William Constable gave work to several local craftsmen, including Jeremiah Hargrave from Hull, who was employed to work alongside Chippendale's men. Many houses have looked for new ways of funding, and in 2017, the Burton Constable Estate hosted Radio 1's Big Weekend in its grounds. Wassend Hall, near Hornsey, was also built for a member of the Constable family. Joan Constable bought the land from St Mary's Abbey, York, one of the wealthiest abbeys in the country, at the time of Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries. Later, the property was added to by the purchase, for £50, of Hornsey Mere, the largest freshwater lake in Yorkshire. A manor house built on the site was developed around 1770 by the then owner, Marmaduke Constable. But within 50 years, this house had fallen into disrepair. So Reverend Charles Constable commissioned Thomas Cundy to design a new house and stable block overlooking the mere. By the 1840s, the Constable family owned land in various parts of the East Riding. Constable Street and Wassend Street in Hull still exist. During World War II, the house was requisitioned by the Army, with Bridlington architect Francis Johnson redesigning the house after the war and demolishing some of the Victorian additions. The walled gardens probably existed in the Tudor period to supply the house with vegetables, fruit and flowers, but the summer house dates from 2000. Originally called Sowerby House, Sowerby Hall was the home of the Graham family from 1714. John Graham was from a family of mariners and merchants who increased his wealth by 2 advantageous marriages. It was John and his second wife Mary who built the central block of the house. The gardens contain one of the oldest monkey puzzle trees in England. On the 23rd of September 1779, the Battle of Flamborough Head took place within sight of the house, when ships of the Royal Navy, commanded by Richard Pearson, were intercepted by ships commanded by John Paul Jones, fighting on behalf of the Americans in the War of Independence. Over 100 men died and at least 150 were injured. And although the battle was an embarrassment for the Royal Navy, Pearson was knighted the following year. Extensions were added to the house during the 19th century, including a stable block and orangery, but by 1934 the house had been sold to Bridlington Corporation, who renamed it Sowerby Hall. In June 1936, it was opened to the public by aviatrix Amy Johnson. Amy died in January 1941, having bailed out over the Thames estuary during a mission for the Air Transport Auxiliary and was drowned. Her body was never recovered. The refurbishment that was undertaken in 2013 aimed at showing how the house would have looked around 1910. A particular favourite of mine, as it was one of the first country houses I visited during a school trip a few years ago, is Sledmere House. As the author Simon Jenkins points out in his book Discover Britain's Historic Houses, it is now a Georgian house designed over 3 centuries. The Sykes family, originally from the West Riding, have owned the estate for many years, but the original Georgian house was destroyed by fire in 1911. The Georgian house had been built in the 1780s, largely to designs by Sir Christopher Sykes. Entering the 20th century mansion, created after the fire, the hall leads to the staircase, with its statue of Apollo. Sir Christopher's library was restored to its original designs and colours by Francis Johnson in the late 1970s. And although the original carpet was lost in the fire, the marquetry floor shows how it might have looked. Sir Christopher owned a Gutenberg Bible, which fortunately was sold to the Metropolitan Museum, New York, before the fire damaged so many of the books. One of the most unusual rooms in any country house is the Turkish room, copied from the Sultan's apartments in Istanbul. Sir Mark Sykes, MP for Central Hull, in 1911 began to raise the Wagoners' Reserve. After the First World War, Sir Mark determined to build a monument to honour the men of the reserve. Sadly, Sir Mark died of pneumonia following a bout of Spanish flu before the monument was completed. It was unveiled in September 1920 and still stands in the village of Sledmere. In 2018, following the hot summer, drone technology was able to expose the outline of Lonsborough Hall near Market Wheaton, demolished almost 200 years earlier. The house had belonged to the Clifford family, Lancastrian supporters who lost some of their land after the Battle of Towton, but regained it when Henry VII became king. By the 17th century, the estate had passed to Richard, Earl of Burlington, who extended the house, building the stable block and almshouses as well. Further work was done by Richard Boyle, the third Earl, whose London home, Burlington House, later housed the Royal Academy. Boyle was the man who advised Henry Maister after the tragic fire at Maister House, and was the patron of many artists and designers, including the Bridlington-born designer William Kent. After the third Earl died, in 1753, the house passed to the Devonshire family, who spent little time there, neglecting it in favour of their Derbyshire house, Chatsworth, so that by 1819 Lonsborough Hall had been demolished. A new house, Lonsborough Park, was built on the estate and was owned for about 5 years by George Hudson, the railway king, principally, apparently, to block a rival company from building the railway line between York and Market Wheaton. A portrait of George Hudson hung in York Mansion House, but after his fall from grace, his name was erased from the painting, and George Hudson Street in York was renamed Railway Street until reverting back in 1971. After Hudson's departure, Lonsborough Park was used mostly for shooting parties and was even known as the Shooting Box, and was visited by Edward VII, his son George V, and members of the aristocracy. Scarborough Hall stood on the site of a medieval moated manor house, and this house was the home of Sir John Hotham, the parliamentarian who denied Charles I access to Kingston upon Hull. The manor had belonged to the Hotham family since the 13th century, and the Hothams had served the crown well until Sir John barred Beverley Gate to the king. By January 1645, both Sir John Hotham and his son had lost their heads. The hall became the property of Sir John's grandson, also Sir John, who succeeded in restoring much of the family's fortunes, and also bought 200 acres in nearby South Dalton, to the west of Scarborough. When this Sir John died in 1689, and his son 2 years later, the lands and title passed to a soldier cousin, Sir Charles Hotham. But by 1705, the original hall had been destroyed by fire. With the land in South Dalton, Sir Charles Hotham's son built Dalton Hall. But the new house wasn't completed until 1775, and was occupied by another Sir Charles, the 8th Baronet. This house was designed by York-based Thomas Atkinson, costing Sir Charles £30,000. By 1813, the Hothams had become Baron Hotham, and were owners of one of the largest estates in Yorkshire, and Beaumont Baron Hotham lived at Dalton Hall for over 50 years. Like other aristocratic families, the Hothams didn't have a straightforward descent from father to son, so that the title and the lands passed to brothers or male cousins. By 2004, the 8th Lord and Lady Hotham had moved to a newly built dower house in the village of South Dalton, with the hall and grounds becoming a venue for weddings and other functions. Like Dalton Hall, several country houses have been put to other uses, especially during the 20th century. Escrick Hall, near York, was originally in the East Riding, but boundary changes mean it is now officially in North Yorkshire. The present house was built for Henry Thompson, who was MP for Heddon towards the end of the 17th century. The original 2-storey building was enlarged by Henry's grandson, Bealby Thompson, who commissioned York architect John Carr to make further additions, including a stable block. One of my favourite stories about John Carr is that he was commissioned to repair Constable Burton Hall near Leyburn for Sir Marmaduke Wyville, but Carr actually demolished the existing house and rebuilt it. I don't know how Sir Marmaduke reacted. The Thompson family became Barons Wenlock in 1839, and the 3rd Baron Wenlock married Lady Constance Mary Lascelles, daughter of the Earl of Harewood. As the couple only had one daughter, the house passed out of the family and into the possession of the Forbes Adams family. The hall, now a wedding and holiday venue, is more commonly known as Escrick Park. Home Hall, at home on Spalding Moor, was built for Marmaduke Lord Langdale, whose family had lived in the East Riding since at least the 14th century, owning several estates in the area. Although he disagreed with some of Charles I's policies, Langdale did become a leading royalist soldier during the Civil War. He was related, by marriage, to our old friend Sir John Hotham, the parliamentarian. After the royalist defeat in 1649, Langdale followed Charles II into exile and converted to Catholicism, returning to Yorkshire at the Restoration in 1660, having recovered his estates. However, his health was not good, and he died at Home Hall on the 5th of August 1661, and was buried beneath the chancel of All Saints' Church, Sancton. Langdale's eldest son, also called Marmaduke, became governor of Hull, and his daughter Mary married into the Staunton family, who were related to the Dukes of Norfolk. Like the Dukes of Norfolk, the Stauntons were deeply involved in Catholic affairs, building St William's College for the training of Catholic schoolmasters in the 1840s. When Home Hall was sold in the 1920s, it became a Catholic convent and continued as such for 50 years until taken over by Sue Ryder as a care home, which closed in 2018. Houghton Hall, near Sancton, is another house originally owned by the Langdale family of Home Hall, being built in 1765, though there had been a house on the estate since the 14th century. The 18th century house was designed by Thomas Atkinson of York, who had built Dalton Hall for the Hothams. In 1856, Houghton Hall was inherited by Joyce Langdale, whose second husband was Earl Fitzwilliam of Wentworth Woodhouse in West Yorkshire. Moving to Wentworth Woodhouse after her marriage, Lady Fitzwilliam gave Houghton Hall and its 5,000-acre estate to her sister Alethea's son, Rupert Watson, Baron Manton. On his death in 2003, the estate and title passed to his son Miles, who, together with his wife Libby, restored the east wing, turning it into holiday lets and a wedding venue. Rise Hall featured on the Channel 4 programme Restoration Nightmare, when Sarah Beanie showcased the work undertaken with her husband Graham to renovate the hall. Built between 1815 and 1820, Rise Hall replaced an earlier manor house. This manor house appears to have had quite a few prominent owners, even being said to have been owned by King Canute. By the 15th century, the estate had passed to Richard Neville, known as Warwick the Kingmaker, and later to Richard, Duke of Gloucester, later Richard III, who was married to Warwick's younger daughter, Anne. The Bethel family owned the estate from the 17th century, with Richard Bethel, MP for the East Riding, rebuilding the main house using York architects Watson and Pritchett. During World War II, Rise Hall was occupied by the army and later became St Philomena's Convent School. When the school closed, the house stood empty for 10 years before Sarah and Graham bought it in 2001. Originally intending to make the house their family home after restoration, the couple turned Rise Hall into a successful wedding venue, but sold the house and business in 2019 to move to Somerset. Rowley Manor is not a traditional country house, but was built as the rectory for St Peter's Church, Rowley, in 1621, when the Reverend Ezekiel Rogers was the rector there, probably to replace an earlier building. The stained glass window in St Peter's Church is dedicated to Reverend Rogers. In the 1630s, the nonconformist Reverend Rogers, together with about 20 parishioners, set sail for America from Hull on board the sailing ship John. And on reaching Massachusetts, the group founded a town which they named Rowley. By the late 1700s, Rowley Manor had been enlarged, although it remained the village rectory until the 1920s. It was bought by Thomas Filmer Wilson, whose family owned the shipping fleet, the Ellerman Wilson line. Filmer Wilson modernised the house and lived there until his death in 1969, when the house was converted into a country house hotel, also becoming a wedding venue. Saltmarsh Hall originally belonged to the Saltmarsh family, who first owned the land in the 11th century. Like Rise Hall, Saltmarsh Hall was a Watson and Pritchard house, and was built for Philip Saltmarsh in the 1820s, costing him £4,000. Stables were added later, as well as extensions to the house to accommodate Philip's 10 children. By the 1970s, the last Saltmarsh, Captain Philip Saltmarsh, had died without an heir, and the house was sold. It became a country house wedding venue when it was purchased by Kate and Roland White, and is said to be haunted, having featured on TV's Most Haunted series in 2014. Whilst some country houses ceased to be homes for the gentry, especially during the 20th century, other houses were demolished or rebuilt for other purposes. Winstead Hall was also known as Red Hall, and is thought to have been built following designs by Richard Boyle, Lord Burlington, owner of Lonsborough Hall, though there was a medieval hall on the site which was abandoned about 1579. The hall, commissioned in the 1720s, was the home of Sir Robert, Baronet Hildyard, who succeeded to the title on the death of his grandfather in 1687 and became MP for Heddon. Sir Robert's grandfather, also called Sir Robert, had served as a Major General on the Royalist side during the Civil War, and was Gentleman of the Bedchamber to Charles I. The family had held land in the area since Norman times, with estates at Patrington and elsewhere. The house was not particularly large, having only 10 bedrooms, a drawing room, library, and morning room. A smaller block on the north side was the servants' wing and domestic offices, and there was also a stable block, designed by our old friend John Carr. In 1920 the house was sold to Hull Corporation, who demolished it in 1936 to build Winstead Hospital. Originally known as Water Hall, Water Priory was built by the Pennington family as a 2-storey, 5-bay country house, though over the years much of the house was altered and enlarged. The Penningtons became Barons Muncaster, and in 1878 the 5th Lord Muncaster sold the house to Charles Wilson, the Hull shipping magnate, who became Lord Dunburnham and served as MP for Hull for 30 years. Lord Dunburnham began further alterations, including a great hall, grand marble staircase and clock tower, resulting in a house of nearly 100 rooms. After Lord Dunburnham's death, the house was sold, later becoming the property of the Marquis of Normanby, though it was merely used as a shooting lodge. Lord Normanby also used Southwold House at Water for the same purpose. By 1972, Water Priory had been demolished. Malcolm Healy of Wren Kitchens bought the estate in the 1990s. And although the land continued to be used for shooting partridge and pheasant, in 2018 the Healy family submitted plans for a brand new country house to be built on the estate. Welton House in the 18th century was a small country house belonging to James Shaw. Shaw's daughter married Joseph Williamson, and the couple inherited the house, but moved to Melton Hill, leaving Welton House to be occupied by Joseph's brother, Thomas. Thomas Williamson began basically rebuilding the house and improving the grounds, and when he died, the house was left to his daughter Anne, who was married to London banker Robert Raikes. When Anne and Robert moved from Essex to Welton House, Robert Raikes opened a bank in High Street, Hull. The mausoleum in the grounds was built by Raikes and continued to stand after the house was demolished in 1952. Robert Raikes is also responsible for the 4 clocks on the Tower of Holy Trinity in Hull, now Hull Minster. Many country houses were built in the East Riding of Yorkshire over the centuries. Though they played a large part during both wars as training camps, hospitals and schools, social changes and increased costs meant that many were no longer viable as homes for the gentry, especially as the servants who had kept such houses going for centuries were finding employment elsewhere. For example, Cave Castle at South Cave was the home from the mid-18th century of the Barnard family, some of whom served as mayors of Hull. A Gothic-style building stood from 1787, though the current Cave Castle only dates from 1875. Cave Castle was sold in 1938 and has since had several owners, today being a country house hotel, wedding venue and golf club. Designed by Leeds architect Charles Chorley for shipowner Arthur Wilson in the 1870s, Tranby Croft achieved notoriety in 1890 with the Baccarat scandal, which took place during the visit of the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII. The house became the headquarters of the Wilson family business, as from the tower it was possible to see the company ships on the Humber. And in 1944 it became Hull High School for Girls. In 2005, when Hull Grammar School moved there from Cottingham, the two schools combined to form Hull Collegiate School. Although country house building really began in Tudor times, many houses date from the 18th century, when, as well as gentry and aristocracy who had owned land for centuries, many newly rich young men had money with which to build. Collections were acquired during the Grand Tour and needed to be on display. especially as improved transport links meant greater movement between country houses. Warrington Hall belonged to the Strickland family, credited with introducing turkeys to this country in the 16th century. Anlaby House was built in the 1790s for Hull merchant John Boys, and High Paul House a few years earlier for shipbuilder Benjamin Blades. Everingham Hall is yet another John Carr house, much altered in the 19th century, and Hotham Hall was built around 1720 for William Burton. Many country houses still survive by opening their homes to paying visitors, by becoming schools, hotels, wedding venues, or by hosting live events. Some have even found much needed funding as locations for TV and film productions. Only a few still exist as country homes for the rich and titled.